Welcome, everyone. I am Ashley, the Director of Financial Narrative. Thank you all so much for joining us today to discuss ESG. We have a wonderful panel for you. And without further ado, this is Ashley Ramsay, who is the Chief Operating Officer of CFA Society in the UK. Thank you so much, Ashley.
Thanks. So hi everyone, and welcome to our session, Authentically Communicating about ESG, and we're really glad that you joined us. I think you're going to enjoy today's session, and so to kick us off, I'd like to introduce you first of all to our panel. So would each of you like to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your interest in ESG and your role with ESG today?
Sure.
And if I could go to Claire.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We're excited to talk to you today. My name is Claire Burns. I'm the Chief Marketing and Communications Officer at the Hartford. The Hartford has a long-standing commitment to ESG, which we'll talk about throughout the day, but my personal commitment has stemmed from very early in my career when I've always felt that companies need to work with society to solve intractable problems and need to move beyond profit motivation to actually help lift communities and society. So that's my long-standing belief that ESG matters.
Thanks. Jeso?
Sure. Hi, my name is Jessa O'Neil. I'm the Communications Director for WaterEquity, a global asset manager. And my interest in ESG and impact investing started a little while ago when I was working in the arts and cultural sector. I saw a lot of artists really diving into deeper issues around environmentalism and social issues. And I wanted to kind of discover what is the capital at play behind those issues and how can we use capital to solve some of these issues.
Thanks. And Leeya?
Yes, hi everyone. Nice to speak to you today. My name's Leeya Hendricks, and I am the CMO for both Prytek and Capita. We'll talk about that a little later. One a technology firm, the other a managed services and consulting firm. But mine is kind of stemmed from my passion for sustainability and ESG, which has always been throughout my career. Many of the organizations that I've worked for, I've either participated in the programs or have actually been responsible for launching the programs in driving the brand positioning. So I'm very passionate about it and continue to be passionate about it.
Thanks, Leeya. And just to let everybody know, my name's Ashley Ramsay. I'm Chief Operating Officer at CFA UK, which is the leading investment professional association in the UK. And the society is actually instrumental in pioneering sustainability education for investment professionals. And we currently have both qualifications and professional learning products in ESG investing and climate investing, and we will be shortly launching something in impact investing. My personal interest in ESG is leading on embedding ESG as central to our core purpose as a professional association, and obviously helping out develop some of the products that I just mentioned. So as we dive into our first question today, we do want to encourage all of you to add in your commentary and questions in the chat throughout the session. And we will be opening up the floor for questions and discussion towards the end of the session. But let's dive right in and start off talking about where ESG is positioned within your organisation. So I'm going to ask all our panellists, why was that decision made? And as we're all from varying areas of finance, how does that impact where ESG decisions are being made? Sorry, that was a bit of a mouthful. So first of all, why was that decision made in your organisation?
Who do you want to start with?
I will go to you, Claire.
Okay, great. I'm happy to go first. So I work, as I said, for the Hartford, which is a publicly traded property casualty insurer based in the US. And in our organization, we have a sustainability governance committee, which sits at the C-suite and includes lots of different roles across the business. So I would say the function of ESG and sustainability is embedded across our organization, but the Office of Sustainability, which supports our Sustainability Governance Committee and has some dedicated resources, sits in my organization reporting to me as the head of in my communications role. So it's really because we need to actually be able to not only do the good work around ESG, but also communicate it to internal and external stakeholders. That's why the decision was made to have that team report into me, but they really do support leaders across our organization.
Okay, and Leeya, how about you?
Yeah, so in Delta Capita, we also have a working group for sustainability that extends across different areas of business. Of course, marketing plays a key role in that because we are driving internal and external communications of our efforts around sustainability. And we've recently hired or really employed appointed rather a CSO, a Chief Sustainability Officer. And in terms of the decisions for that, as I mentioned, very much focused on marketing, but also HR. So I think from a marketing perspective, we champion brand building and customer engagement and the importance of that brand building and values. But at the same time, we've got HR and marketing work very closely with HR in terms of ensuring that our employees are living those values and really aligning our moral purpose. So you can see how it extends across both, especially because we've got a key value in our business that actually speaks to partnership and how we actually drive that across our communities, including our employees.
That's very interesting. And how are your employees actually embracing the whole ESG thing? Have you found that's been very much supported across the business?
Oh, yes, definitely. And certainly, you know, as I mentioned, from a values perspective, that partnership is one of our key values. And it actually defines how to make a positive, sustainable contribution to our communities. And this forms part of our performance management and feedback framework as well. So increasingly, we are seeing that people want to work for companies that stand for a lot more, right? And therefore, it's quite embedded and immersed within our culture as well.
Thanks, Leeya. So, Jeso, can I ask you why the decision was made in your organisation?
Sure. WaterEquity is a little unique. We were established from as an innovation of water and sanitation nonprofit water.org. And we were established to mobilize and scale the amount of private capital that was dedicated towards the water and sanitation crisis. And impact and ESG were therefore baked into the creation of WaterEquity. And so it wasn't a decision made after the fact, it was a decision made that was baked into why we were created.
Great, thank you. So can we talk a little bit about the varying levels of maturity in terms of the ESG journey and what your organisations are doing? Obviously, you know, some of you will be a little further on in your journey than others. Jeso, do you want to pick up on that one first?
Sure. We are a little more mature in our ESG journey. I think in starting out from a fund manager perspective, I would start asking the questions. I would explore what your goals are. Is it from a top line organizational perspective, or is it within the investment fund? In the investment fund, that's going to be more driven by your investment management team, whereas the organizational top line can be around the impact that your company is having. And I think like a couple of different frameworks that you could look at that are really helpful are the B Corp movement in terms of organizational. And then if your investment management team is looking for how they can find ESG data points that are material to the investments that you're working on, I would say the Global Impact Investing Network, or GIN, is a great place to start as well. For someone such as WaterEquity that's a little more mature in the ESG journey, I think really focusing on how you articulate the why or the purpose behind why you're looking at ESG or impact investing, and how to articulate that. Who is having the benefit? Where are these the impact being had? I think personally for me, and I think that the data shows for millennials and Gen Z, it's not enough to just say you're having ESG across the organization or across the funds anymore. It has to be kind of the purpose behind why, even if it's just from a risk mitigation standpoint. Otherwise, it can be seen as lip service or maybe even greenwashing.
Thanks, Jeso, that's really useful. And Claire, on the same topic, in terms of your organisation's sort of maturity journey, do you have anything to add there, and also some recommendations on what people might do if they don't already have an ESG framework within their organization?
Sure. I think Jeso was very good at articulating and gave great resource examples for how to start out for companies that are new on this journey. Mm-hmm. I'd say we've been on the journey, and I this might sound a little bit, it'll sound as it sounds. We are a 211-year-old company, and I would say because our whole purpose is to create resilience for people and for vulnerable populations, we've been on an ESG journey for 211 years. It's just recently gained the moniker of ESG. And I think that's important for all of us as we look at the maturity of our organizations and our entities, is how long have we been true to purpose and true to this idea behind stakeholder capitalism. For us, it's part of our DNA, and that's how our CEO talks about it. So your messaging doesn't have to be how you got to ESG today, now that we're calling it ESG and have for the last few years, but really, how is it true to who you are as a company, the role you play in the world, and the impact that you're having? Because as Jeso pointed out, the next generation of talent, and I say that because it's not my generation, it may be the generation of other panelists, is much more attracted to companies that have true, genuine purpose, can articulate it and can demonstrate it through actions more so than words or statements. And so we really are trying now, as we've been on a climate journey for about 15 years, where we've been really actively engaged in taking actions to combat the impacts of climate risk. But as a social organization and an ethical organization, we have an equally long track record. So really finding those proof points, articulating them, sharing them is going to be just as important as doing the standard reporting along financial services lines.
That's incredibly helpful, Claire. Thank you very much. And Leeya, if I could turn to you in terms of sort of tools that you might recommend to others, either from a framework perspective or a measurement perspective, are there any other resources that you would recommend?
Yeah, so we've basically at Delta Capita, we've used an ESG matrix where we track and align our efforts from carbon emissions, health and safety, right through to data protection, which works really well. And in terms of additional resources, I think for marketers specifically, there's a great resource hub actually called Can Marketing Save the Planet, which is really driven by Michelle Covell. It's a great resource for content across different areas of sustainability and covers ESG. And then also a recent book by Michelle and Gemma Butler and Gerard Evans. It's a really good book on sustainable marketing that really covers everything. And then I'd also add the Chartered Institute of Marketing. There's a recent program on it where you can obviously get a certification around sustainability and ESG. And I think that's a really great resource as well.
Great, that's fantastic. Thank you. So in terms of other stakeholders, because obviously we've talked broadly about each of the organisations that you represent, but have you come across situations where there are certain stakeholders, either within or external to your organisation, that have been perhaps a little more difficult to convince of the merits of ESG and the fact that it needs to be high on your company's agenda? And if you have come across that, how would you advise our audience on how to approach those sorts of conversations? So Jeso, could I come to you first?
Sure. Not with WaterEquity, but with a wealth management firm that I was working with. For me, it was about making the business case to the skeptics in terms of showing the data on our own internal books of business, as well as across the industry, that the growth of ESG and impact investing wasn't necessarily a trend, but that investors were really interested across the spectrum from retail to institutional in investing with ESG or impact or values-based investing in mind. And kind of managing those skeptics is being transparent in the data around ESG or impact and finding ways to kind of tailor that message, because it's similar to like any type of communications or marketing plan. It's not a one-fits-all approach. You really need to figure out what resonates with them in terms of what data points, what specifically about the business case. So that's what I would suggest.
Thank you. And Leeya, if I could come back to you and ask you the same question.
Yes, I think when we look at stakeholders, that includes customers, investors, employees, and I guess communities at large. And increasingly, we're seeing that they're becoming a lot more cynical about whether, companies are actually walking the talk and that these ethical issues are actually being, lived in that sense. So convincing them has been or has become rather a defining challenge for us as marketing teams. And I think the good news is that it's moving in the right direction for marketers as we start to develop a lot of this kind of content, but embedding ESG related values and purpose in everything that you do is really helpful. So I think that defined purpose and values should provide an overarching social and environmental mission that stakeholders can really understand and buy into. So to help and promote that purpose and values, marketing should really show internal and external stakeholders how they are linked to your specific ESG values and goals, and really drive that internal engagement, so that inside-out approach. And doing this will help your company's growth and financial targets too. We've seen that purpose-driven companies actually achieve higher market share and outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Claire, if I could turn to you and ask you a little bit more about your company culture and how, as an organisation, you've brought everybody onto the same page in terms of ESG messaging.
Sure, no, that's a great question. And I'd say that our culture at the Hartford is extremely collaborative. So ESG for us is a team sport. So generally, unlike a lot of companies, we have our compensation tied to collective goals as opposed to individual goals. There's a little bit that's around individual, but we all are looking at the same set of metrics. And similar to what Leeya described, we have very clear metrics that the organization is pursuing around ESG, particularly around climate and DEI. So it's very visible in the organization as to where we're all headed. It's also a key component of our investment thesis and what our investor relations team and our leaders say at every investor call. So there's messaging at the highest level as part of the company narrative that we're sharing quarterly with investors, but it's also part of our internal messaging as part of how we're talking about our progress as a company against all kinds of goals. And it really is part of the culture. The culture is very values driven, very purpose driven, very collaborative. And there's just a lot of energy and enthusiasm around all of these goals and this topic. So it's fun.
And Jeso, in your organisation, would you say there's that same level of enthusiasm and, sort of getting right behind the purpose?
Yeah, I think so, especially because we have such a niche focus on water and sanitation. We attract talent that is really focused on impact, really focused on the water and sanitation sector, really focused on social and environmental issues. So coming into the organization, you kind of are embedded with that culture.
And are you finding that, I think, Leeya, it was yourself that mentioned that it's attractive to people who are looking to work in this space, that a company has those values and that purpose very clearly articulated? And are you all finding that that's attracting a good caliber of marketing talent into your organisation, or talent more broadly, not just in the marketing sphere?
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot more from a Gen Z perspective, right? So your young talent really wants to see that purpose embedded within the culture. And we certainly are seeing that from an attraction and retention perspective as well. So I think, some of the examples that Claire mentioned as well, when you're looking at your D&I, also very strong for inclusion for, new employees, and really that being attractive in terms of the brand. So what does your brand stand for? Not only from an internal perspective, but also external, right? To your investors and to new employees. So yes, certainly.
So I'm going to move on now just to sort of open up a conversation around greenwashing, which obviously from a marketing perspective is a hot topic, and just ask the panel generally around how your organisation has gone about forming the brand narratives around ESG. And I appreciate some of this has been covered with the values and the purpose and what we've been talking about previously, but very specifically, how do you tell your story? How do you make it authentic? First of all, how do you avoid fluff and sort of over padding? But probably more importantly, how do you avoid being criticised as greenwashing? Because that can have incredibly difficult implications for your brand reputation. So Claire, could I come to you first?
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. It's a really important question. And we think about our industry, there's actually players are separating themselves in the marketplace between those that are, our lead competitor, for example, is saying that to declare a net zero target at this stage would be irresponsible to our investors, and that it would actually be, that it's actually a bad thing to be part of that net zero group too soon, because it would mean that we're moving out too quickly ahead of where the measurement standards are. So we want to separate ourselves from that narrative and say, we're not going to be able to make any progress as a global society unless we do this together, and we need to be committed to coming up with the measurements. We acknowledge that they aren't there, but let's come up with the measurements, let's lock arms, let's do this together. So our whole approach in terms of brand narrative is about story doing, not storytelling. So we're not trying to weave a narrative that is potentially perceived as fluff or as false. We want to actually take the actions that demonstrate this commitment and do it time and time again through a sort of what we call it as a rolling thunder of moves in the marketplace that show we've made a commitment to invest in alternative energy. We've made a commitment to be a first mover underwriter in alternative energy. We've made a commitment on social justice to give a large percentage of our charitable giving to communities to create resilience for them in the face of environmental hazards and climate concerns. We've declared not to underwrite any new coal or tar sands opportunities, and we've committed to a net zero target. So we're taking action, story doing, not storytelling.
I love that. And it's, you know, it's walking the talk, isn't it? And making sure that you can absolutely substantiate what you're saying your organization stands for. That's fantastic. Jeso, what about from your perspective?
Yeah, the part of my job that I love the most is sharing the stories of how our investments benefit individuals, families, communities, and the impact that our investments are having on regions and geographies. That is our brand narrative, is showing how the capital markets can be an effective tool in solving for the water and sanitation crisis. And for us, data is key. Both from like a large aggregate level, but also from the individual level. And we avoid greenwashing or fluff in our storytelling by combining this aggregated data from our investments, individual stories from our beneficiaries, as well as looking at the larger third-party evidence base that really shows that these investments are driving economic development, public health, gender equality, and providing resilience to the impacts of climate change. So we work with our sister organization, water.org, and we have our own in-house director of ESG and impact, Genevieve Edens. And I have access to a lot of data, information, evidence bases to help really craft these stories authentically and tell kind of the impact that we're having across the spectrum.
Thank you. And Leeya, from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think from an internal and external perspective, so internally, of course, we have it immersed and entrenched in everything that we do from a culture perspective, but also our policies, but externally as well, because as I mentioned, from a consulting perspective, we also offer sustainable finance as a service to our tier one banks. So we actually position that. But if we go back to your initial question, trying to avoid fluff, I think there's some key takeaways or some key things that you can do. So don't try to do everything, right? I think that's it. Try and focus on something that's relevant and important to your business and that's inspiring, right? You don't need to do all of it, but make it quite specific so you can feel it and you can really live it. I think the other is really incorporating ESG communications into your organization's literature. So make sure that your investors and all your stakeholders know about your strategy and really understand it, right? So you're not just trying to broad brush it, but you're focusing and really pushing it into everything that you do where it's relevant, and then show genuine commitment. I think Jeso just mentioned it, that as much as you don't have to do kind of everything, you have to show how you are critically getting this work done, how you really living it. Can you actually show some proof points and actually, position it in that way. And then I guess, getting third-party certification. I think this is, also an area, if this is an option for you. Of course, if not, you can focus on collecting your robust evidence, but there are a lot of certifications in that regard where you can start to see a rating that can help build your credibility in that area, and then focus on the positives. I think that there's active change happening, right? There's solutions, focus on those rather than the problems. I think that we are all trying to do something, position that, and then actually do it well. So I think this applies to, all your stakeholders. And then, making it relevant, if we just look at the E in Delta Capita, yes, from an environmental perspective, we've kind of changed our green office policies. So we know that, travel and change, that's changed from hybrid working and trying to reduce carbon emissions, but also we've changed our policies aligned to a cycle to work scheme at Delta Capita. So we committed to being more socially responsible as a company and really engaging actively with our staff and sustainability. So we've launched the cycle to work scheme, and we've got like a day of annual leave for volunteering, where you can actually really position it, and we're driving it at the forefront of our company and brand. So just one example really of how we're actually driving green employee benefits within our organization.
Yeah, and if I could ask the other two panelists the same for their organisations, internally, what moves has your own organisation made to make sure that you are as sustainable as possible, and is that something that you then use as a proof point within your own marketing activities?
We've certainly done that from our physical plant, really making sure that we are carbon neutral. We have electric vehicle charging stations around the campus. We've changed our heating and cooling system to be more energy efficient. We have a compostable cafeteria. We have, but we also don't have a lot of people coming into the office, which I think is also a carbon neutral move. We've shifted some of our travel practices to be more sustainable. So certainly being true to your principles and demonstrating to the world that that's who you are and that's how you're contributing to the world is certainly part of it. We've also created a lot of incentives for our customers to do the same. So if we're a property casualty insurer insuring businesses around the world, we are giving them incentives to be carbon neutral themselves in terms of scope 1, but also when they have a claim. So for example, if there's a catastrophe or natural disaster that destroys someone's property, they can build back greener with our claims practices. So they don't have to build back exactly as they were before. We can help them create better buildings, more resilient buildings, more climate resilient structures, and even replacing cars and vehicles they can replace with electric vehicles in the future to create a better world.
And Jeso, anything from you?
Yeah, not from a sustainability standpoint, from a social justice standpoint. We've really looked organizationally. We've developed a task force called Race Equity that really focuses not only on our marketing, but also across the organization. How are we addressing social impact and social justice issues, not only in the United States, but globally, because we're we're a smaller global company, but we're very spread out. And how are we doing that across all of our operations, marketing, our investments, even our operations within our administration. And so we really kind of focused on that more in how we're addressing that on a larger scale.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to take this opportunity to remind everybody that's tuned in today that please do add in any questions or comments in the commentary, and we will get to your questions shortly. But I'm going to sort of shift the focus now to talk, I suppose, more on a global level here. It won't have escaped anybody's notice that we're moving into a recession. So I'm keen to hear the panel's viewpoints on how that's impacting your ESG efforts, and is it changing the focus at all? Leeya, could I come to you first?
Yes, so I think no. it's not really impacting it based on our focus on our clients and really from an internal perspective. Yes, there's changes in the market, and the situation, obviously with the realized inflation, will, I guess, affect the decisions made by customers and corporations and investors. But in such an uncertain environment, I think it's important really to kind of take a step back and really look at some of the structural trends, and one which I think is sustainability. So maintaining that for me is quite critical, because I think more this kind of focus on environment is all about resource efficiency, productivity, I guess, equal opportunity and diversity and inclusion, and all of those areas we are focusing on. So we maintain that and we continue to focus on that, especially access to finance as well as health and well-being, still critical for us and still maintained. So even though our clients are financial services focused, we are actually helping them a lot more in terms of the consulting with the current market issues, but sustainability still remains quite as a priority for us.
And Jeso, thank you. And Jeso, what about yourself?
Yeah, for WaterEquity and other, I would say, more impact-focused fund managers, a recession or a downturn in the market doesn't change or shift the focus of our investments, especially because we're so niche on solving the water and sanitation crisis. In 2020, for instance, we saw a slowdown in the speed with which we raised capital, but we kind of remain steadfast in that mission and the value proposition that we bring to our investors as well.
Thanks. And Claire, any observations from you?
We're happy to add some perspective. So in a bull market, when everything's thriving and everything's, the economy's doing really, really well, there's a lot more movement toward experimentation and a lot of appetite for new energy models, new investments. There's a lot more room for error. And so our company, in particular, our investment team, was embracing all kinds of new types of investments. Now, as you start to think about a bear market and you think about a recessionary economy, there's certainly pushback from our investment team to say, can we retreat to fossil fuels? And we keep pushing, we keep saying, no, now is not the time. Now, obviously, you need to have a balance in your portfolio, but we're trying to continue to drive toward all of our investment principles and make sure that there's not any, what I would call backsliding in terms of thinking about different imperatives. But it is tricky. It was tricky with the Ukraine conflict that happened earlier this year. Suddenly the whole world seemed to be focused on needing to look at different sources of energy and maybe backing off a little bit on some of our environmental principles. So we need to ebb and flow along with where the world is going, but also hold true to our standards and principles as we think about this.
Thank you. So I just wondered if we also could have a think about, sort of building a little bit on what you've just mentioned there, Claire, larger global issues. I think, obviously the energy crisis and, some of the things that are happening as a result of, warfare or the climate crisis. There are some, a couple of you have said that you're staying the course, and Claire, you've said that, you have had a bit of pushback from your investment team, but just generally from a marketing perspective, is there anything from that feeds through into the messaging that marketers might be putting out there for broader consumption, or do you feel it's about staying the course, reinforcing the messaging, reinforcing, the wins that your respective organisations have actually had and what you've been able to demonstrate in terms of consistency? Jeso, can I come to you first?
Sure. For us, it's not only been about staying the course, but also it's like a yes and type answer where it's staying the course and making sure that we're educating our investors and our stakeholders on some of the issues that are out there from not only a geopolitical standpoint, but also from some of the issues that may crop up with the methods of how we're investing. And so Take water.org and WaterEquity have really pioneered the use of microfinance for household access to water and sanitation in low-income countries. And historically, there has been some criticism of microfinance, and rightly so, and people living in poverty. And so we're making sure how we're kind of making sure that we educate our stakeholders around those issues is by creating materials and being transparent with our process and our policies around impact and ESG scorecards that make these investment decisions around client protections. It's really important for us to show that we're not adding to the criticisms of microfinance, but we're actually working to change that through our investments and through certain client protection policies that we're putting into place. And I think it comes back to being transparent and authentic in your communications and having data and real policies to back it up. Like, we're a very data-driven organization and always make sure that our storytelling and any communications that are coming across are able to be backed up by that data and by those policies.
Thank you. Anyone else with a comment?
Sure, I'll build on that because I think the yes and is really important. It is all about educating and making sure that all of our audiences internally understand and externally, frankly, understand that wading into alternative energy and thinking about climate and thinking about social justice issues differently is not scary. It's not as riddled with uncertainty as they might be thinking that it is, even in a downturning economy, that there are very, very positive benefits to be had for all, both from an economic and a non-economic perspective, and continuing to sharpen that focus is critical.
Thank you. So I think we're probably going to open up some of the questions that have been coming through. So thank you to everybody that has managed to post a question this afternoon. Firstly, I'm going to turn to a question from Michelle Jez, who is asking you, Jeso, if you are able to give another example of how you're addressing social impacts and injustice in your organisation.
Sure. From the fund level and the investment level, water and sanitation is inherently social issues that revolve around women and girls. Women and girls spend 200 hours collecting water and sanitation, and probably the same looking for a place to go to a bathroom if they don't have a private bathroom. And so what we do at the fund level is look from a gender equality standpoint. And our microfinance investments really target microfinance institutions that are working with women on that level, working with them as decision makers in the household to take out these loans to get water and sanitation into their house. And so we're approaching it from a gender equality standpoint and saying, this is a women's issue, how can we approach it in that way? From an organizational standpoint, I think a lot of the Race Equity Task Force revolves around our due diligence process, as well as our marketing process. In our due diligence process, it's about being transparent with some of the gender equality, some of the racial equality things that we're putting into our investments and our organization. And from a marketing standpoint, it's making sure that we're not exploiting the people that we're benefiting, and putting into place policies around how do we show the impact that we're having. We tend to focus less on what we would deem poverty porn and focus more on the solutions at hand, the interventions that are happening and really successfully that are changing people's lives, as opposed to showing the devastation and maybe some of the impacts of climate change that we've seen around water.
Thank you. And sort of, I suppose, building on that somewhat, this is a question from T. Hancock's. Given that ESG really is primarily a tool for investor shareholder returns, why does the panel think that it can be a tool to solve the big societal challenges? Claire, would you like to respond to that?
Sure, and I think this is a lot about the semantics that are happening in the world of ESG. And as you look at even some recent publications on this, it seems like the world might be moving more toward sustainability as a narrative construct over ESG. But this is really, for me, it's semantics. ESG is a measurement tool that can be used for risk management and for evaluating investments. But the world at large has started to define stakeholder capitalism through a lens of ESG. I think the measurement tool is actually how you demonstrate your progress against the broader stakeholder capitalism agenda. So I think they're highly conflated. So I understand the question, but I think it's really a semantic answer. I think that you need to have you need to be true to your company values and principles and be acting toward an agenda that's going to help you do well on those measurements to make movement and progress that you need to have these pay off for all of your stakeholders. But I'm sure my peers have more solid answers on this even than I.
Leeya, would you like to comment?
Yes, I think, I mean, it's the same from my side. I mean, Claire's just articulated really well. It's really, you know, entrenching it into the organization, making sure that you are, you know, fully behind it. I mean, yeah, she encapsulated it really well. There's nothing else to add from a Delta Capita perspective or how we're really driving it externally. Yeah.
Thank you. So we've had a question in from Tom Miller, and I might offer a perspective here, but I'm going to ask the panel first of all. Should non-profit organisations approach ESG messaging from a different perspective, or are the general guidelines transferable? Does anybody on the panel have a viewpoint on that? Nope. I'll weed in then.
I would say they're transferable. We're a nonprofit organization, WaterEquity is, but we're using ESG and impact investing in the same way that a for-profit fund manager would use it. So I do think that regardless of whether it's private capital, philanthropic capital, whatever type of capital that you're using to get there, I think ESG and impact investing across the spectrum should be transferable in terms of messaging.
Yes, and speaking for a non-profit organisation, I would absolutely agree with that. I think at the beginning of the webinar, when we were talking about heritage, values, purpose, you know, the sort of raison d'etre for why our organisations are here, that's absolutely transferable without a shadow of a doubt. And actually, we all, regardless of the sector that we work in, we all share that, you know, so that is our common goal and our common purpose as, you know, champions of ESG. So there are certain aspects in my organisation, for example, we focus very heavily on education, and so therefore, and professional education. So it's very important to us that as part of our narrative, we're encouraging anybody who's involved with ESG to make sure that they have threshold competence, that they know what they're talking about, that they can contribute in a way that ultimately will benefit society, regardless of the organisation that they work for. So I think we work very, very closely with asset managers and other people involved in the investment industry. We may not share the same product or service narrative, but we certainly have that common purpose.
And I think Claire touched upon it when she spoke about semantics. I think the alphabet soup that happens with ESG is kind of a large part of the problem with ESG. I think that the more that we can speak a common language, the better off we'll be in how we communicate it better.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Jeso and Claire said, I think when we look at that culture angle from Delta Capita, certainly, right, if we are looking at it internally, that also extends externally. We also partnering with Planetly, so a technology company that is helping us really measure and analyze and reduce our carbon footprint. So we know that that is, of course, quite important for our clients, but also for us internally as a company. And we commit to, you know, responsible business practices that benefit our people and our clients and our communities and our planet. And we want to position that. We really want to show that. So as part of this, Delta Capita really believe that it's crucial to manage our CO2 emissions and really, you know, through that carbon offsetting and really position that. So if I were to look at it from our angle, internal and external, that is something that really is overarching and that we really hold quite dear to our company and our brand.
Thank you. So we have another great question, actually, from one of our audience members. Dissenting voices from the company, especially in the press, can be a challenge and not a good look. For example, an executive making a remark that's not in line with company stance in relation to ESG. So how do you handle internal dissent that becomes part of the public conversation? Great question. Claire, could I come to you first?
Sure. So we really try to avoid that happening. We spend a lot of effort and energy, as I'm sure others do, on the controls that will keep that from happening. So we want to make sure that folks are aligned in how they think about this, how they talk about this, that anytime we have someone who's in a public forum, that they are well messaged and scripted a little bit before they go into that forum. But on occasion it would happen, and I think it's really about doing damage control in that particular situation. But we really have those key messages that are very well permeating through our organization. We really try to keep people on a relatively common script.
And is that common to Leeya and Jeso, your organizations as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think certainly, from a PR perspective, really briefing that, positioning some key messages, extending that across our spokespeople, certainly from our, executive team as well, our CEO. There are key messages that we entrench within the business, and that, of course, we ensure that that's consistent across our senior leadership team. But I think further to what Claire said, it's just something that, has come up and that I see as a trend is, this kind of eco-anxiety, if you will, right? We actually seeing that, and we positioned a content piece around that, is that more and more there's this kind of impact of global warming has become more, I guess, frequent and intense. And we're actually seeing that across different stakeholders, and that's creating anxiety. And this fear of the unknown allows this kind of the mind to imagine a future based on kind of worst case scenarios. And climate change, is a global issue, and many people feel powerless to actually do anything about it. So it's creating this sense of mental well-being that we're trying to address as well. So it's interesting that the more you communicate and the way you communicate, I think in a positive way is far more important than creating it in a negative way. And we do focus on that when we position our communication, that it is something to ensure that you're looking at solving problems, that you aren't creating more anxiety, because that is adding to mental health. And we know that that's on the increase as well. So yeah, just something to note, and something interesting from a trends perspective.
Thank you. So I think we've probably got time for just one or two more questions. Julian Maguire is asking, what have been the most effective ways of harnessing and showcasing employee attention and enthusiasm for ESGs? So can you give any examples or standout efforts or campaigns that you could share? Leeya, I'm going to come back to you on that one, given the work that you do with HR and employee engagement on this, if you'd like to kick off.
Yes, I think I mentioned earlier that we've done the Cycle to Work scheme. We've also done volunteering. So there's a lot of focus on social enablement and social development. But there's also a very key focus on inclusion and diversity, which is really a key part of ESG, as you're aware. And we have a very strong positioning around messaging on that. We've also got a working group around inclusion and diversity, and we are ensuring that we extend our, I guess, our numbers in that sense. In financial services, as we know, it's a very male-dominated environment, and so we've made a concerted effort to increase our female, positioning in that sense, in terms of hiring, how we actually drive that across levels within our organization. So we've got a strong focus on D&I, gender, but race, ethnicity, and you can see that coming through, very human communications focused, but also very much focused on diversity and inclusion. So we've done many programs around that, a lot of positioning around that, and we're certainly seeing that that's a main differentiator for us when we're attracting new employees, from our competitors wanting to join our firm. purely for an employer brand perspective based on diversity and inclusion.
Thank you. And Claire or Jeso, before we wrap up, any final observations on that same point?
I can share very quickly. We like to do a lot of crowdsourcing. So really going out to our employees through broad campaigns where they can share their ideas on how to contribute in these areas, because that gets them really having an invested stake in our actions as a company. So one of the ideas that came out of one of those crowdsourcing efforts was a sustainable product innovation lab. So we now actually have a really sort of cross-functional team of sprinkling expertise from across the organization that gets together and ideates around how we can make our products more sustainable. That's partly how we got to that green claims initiative that I talked about before. And we also have that same group, not the sustainable product group, but the crowdsourcing resulted in what I think is a really simple and basic idea, but that gets our employees excited, was a pollinator pathway that they built on our campus, where they created a garden that's attracting pollinators. So from very small actions to very big actions, bringing the voice of the employee into it. And doing so, we did it through some technology so that you can engage employees, whether they're remote workers or whether they're on our campus, and they can really share ideas, vote each other's ideas up and down, but really have a stake and a voice in what we're doing as a firm and how we're directing that energy. It'd be really valuable.
Fantastic. Well, I'm just very conscious, actually, that it's probably time for us to wrap up now. It looks like it's all the time that we've got for today. So thank you so much, Claire, Leeya and Jeso, our panelists, for taking time out of your day to be with us. And thanks everybody for coming along and joining in the conversation. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all the questions, but I think we were able to cover off quite a few. So thank you, and I'm going to pass back to Ashley Jones.
Hello, everybody. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to Ashley for hosting and moderating such a wonderful session. I know there was a lot of content information there. Really appreciate all of the insights and information that you all offered. Everyone, there will be a recording of this session, as well as a listing of all of the resources mentioned by our panelists and some additional ESG resources that have been provided by some other members. That will be on financialnarrative.org and will also be sent to your emails. We have lots of events coming up, so do stop by the website, take a look at what's coming up. For those of you who are in New York or London, happy hours are in September and October respectively, and lots of virtual events as well. If you're not yet a member, membership to this organization is complimentary. We look forward to having more of you signed up as official members, and we thank you very much for attending.